Well, I would have come earlier with that stuff here. I don't know how awesome it was, but
Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to this third edition of Meet the Puppeteer for Moving Parts 2017. So basically what's happening, we've got lots of practitioners that are coming in during the week and hosting workshops, and then we're doing a Q&A with them afterwards. So we had Blind Summit here, we had Gavin Glover. Also, if you're interested in this kind of talky, nerdy puppetry stuff, we have a puppetry research conference tomorrow, which is at 1 till 3 p.m. So if you're around, it would be great to see you there. Yes, I think that's everything I have to say. Because today is Stephen Mottram. So a big round of applause. Stephen, if you'd like to... So the idea of these sessions, they're quite informal. I'm going to ask a few questions first and then kind of open it up to the floor. There's quite a lot of you. Just be mindful of asking questions that try to keep them short, and if you've asked a question already, be respectful to other people who also might have questions. So, Stephen, I think it might be a good idea to start. We'll talk a little bit about the show yesterday that probably most of you will have seen. But first of all, talk a little bit about your route into puppetry. And specifically, I was very interested in this relationship between making and performing, because you started as a maker, and that's kind of particularly interesting to me, because we've got a lot of makers here as well for the Making 6-day residency. So if you could start by giving a little bit of background about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, a maker is a very grand word, really. But when I was a teenager, I liked making things, and I made lots of stuff. And I made musical instruments quite a lot, and I like making wooden things. And there was a particular moment that I remember where I had the idea to make a puppet. And I was probably 20, maybe late 19, but probably early 20s. And the moment that I had this idea, I remember I didn't sleep the night that I'd had this idea, because I thought, what a brilliant thing to do. It's a thing, I can make it out of wood, it will be a little person, I'll make it move, I can earn my living with it performing. I thought it's the answer to everything that I've ever thought about, and I'll make something and live by it. And I set off to make this puppet, and I still have it hanging in my workshop, and I called it Pantagruel. And I didn't know at that time that anybody else was making puppets. I thought that it was a unique idea, and that I'd hit on this fantastic magical thing. And I can remember being so alive when I made it. It was one of those moments where I was really inspired to do this very simple act of making a puppet. And I sort of did a lot of, carving of the hands and the face and things. And when I look at it now, it's very primitive, but at the time I was so proud of that puppet, and I thought, this is the best thing I've ever made. And it's funny, because I'd been interested in music, and I'd done lots of other little bits and pieces which I'd flirted with in the way of living off them. But when I thought of doing the puppet, I knew that I'd hit on a really good idea. And all the other ones had lasted for 2 or 3 years, and then I got bored with them. And now, this is more than 40 years ago, and I'm still earning my living now by wiggling ping pong balls around, but basically in the same way. When it came, it was a really good, rich idea. But maker, I don't know. I just like making things.
But what about that, so that transition from making a puppet, being excited about making a puppet, to realising that you could perform and make a living with it?
Yeah, well, it took a while to get there. I made quite a lot of stuff before I finally got forced to go out and do it in front of an audience. But I had a very funny thing happen to me. When I was at school, I had a really inspired art teacher who I really liked, and he played the guitar. And when I was 16, he got this job of, in a local posh restaurant, of doing Elizabethan banquets every Friday night. And because I played the guitar a little bit, he said, Stephen, you come along and you play a little bit of John Dowland and some early music, and you can be in our Elizabethan banquets. So at the age of 16, every Friday night I went out and I played some guitar in front of an audience. I'd always been so frightened working in front of audiences that I thought that I wouldn't be able to carry it off. I thought I'd just, be so nervous I wouldn't be able to do it. Because you had to do school concerts. And I always wet myself and got so nervous doing these things. But on the day that I did this first performance, I was given £4 before I did the performance. They said, this is what you get for doing your 10 minutes of playing the guitar. And in 1972, when this was, £4 for us was really good. It was more than a day's wage for doing some horrible job. So I went on stage thinking, oh, well, blimey, I've already got the money, it doesn't really matter too much. And I found that the motive for working was completely different. It's funny, I wasn't doing it there because I had to prove myself in front of my peers at school. I thought, I'm a professional now because I've got the money already. And I found I went down and did my guitar playing without nerves. And so I already had a relationship with performing, is what I want to say. So when it finally became obvious that I had to go in front of audience with the puppets and do stuff, in a way, I knew that was okay, that I would be able to do that, and I suppose I thought I'll get away with it because I got away with the guitar playing.
Wonderful. Okay, I just want to talk a little bit about the show yesterday that most of you will have seen, the Parachute, particularly just because it made me cry. And I wonder. So what we should say is the Parachute sits alongside the workshop that you're doing today, which was the logic of movement, which you should all do if you ever get the chance to do it, because it's fabulous. Could you talk a little bit about the simplicity of movement, what you find interesting about movement as a puppeteer, and how specifically you've focused on movement through the Parachute in that beautifully simplistic way?
Yeah, well, this first puppet, Pantagruel, was a marionette. Obviously, I started with string puppets, and when I started to make performances, they were always string puppets, and they were always based on me on a little stage bending over doing marionettes, and this has led over the years to when I'm doing performances. I did a lot of British Council stuff in the 1990s, and the British Council liked to do some teaching as well. So I'd go off and do a tour, but then I would also do some workshops while I was doing the touring. And I thought that what would be most interesting and actually most portable would be workshops about movement and pure movement in the puppet theatre, because there aren't very many, and yet really we are movement artists. So I thought that we could do with a few more. And I devised over a long period a whole series of exercises which bring people into awareness of the things that you need to think about when you're doing puppets in front of an audience. And one of these things, which I started doing about 15 years ago, was to have 5 ping pong balls operated by 3 people. So one person had the feet, one person had the arms, and another person had a head. And this was to teach people how to move string puppets, because I think that what is lacking from string puppets generally is a sense that they have their own weight. And if you can make the puppet have its own centre of gravity and show its own weight in all of its movements, which means a secondary movement in opposition to the main movement. So if I take a step, in order to move my left leg, I've got to lean over to the right a bit. That's a secondary movement. Then when my foot's on the ground, then I can place my weight onto it. That's a secondary movement. And it's all these little adjustments of weight which are the important things. And with marionette theatre, I'd seen that people just don't do those secondary movements, and as a consequence, the puppets don't seem to have their own weight. They just look like they're carried by the performer. But once you get these secondary things in, and you start to see the centre of gravity of the puppet itself, then it increases the separation tenfold between the performer and the puppet, and you see the puppet magically appearing to take its own weight and do its own things. And I thought this is such a basic thing that people need to be aware of. So I thought if you have the ping pong balls, you can get people to really have to work on the position of the 5 ping pong balls, so that they really have to display where the weight is every time one of the ping pong balls moves. So, for example, if your ping pong ball man moves one leg, the whole body's got to lean over to compensate for the weight of the leg as it moves out. Do you follow me? And so I'd done this for about 15 years, and then I was sitting there watching some people in a workshop doing it, and I thought, this really looks good. I'll make a show using this technique. And then that was a little bit like the marionette moment as well. I thought, and it won't weigh anything because they're only ping pong balls, so I won't have to schlep it around the world in great big heavy boxes. And then I thought, and if it gets stolen on a flight or I leave it somewhere, I can buy some new ping pong balls. And I thought, well, from that moment on, my ethos was, don't have a technician, don't have any expense, just have little small birdies which are controlled by a domestic dimmer, make it all as light as possible, make it pack into 2 suitcases, and this is going to be the new way of avoiding half a ton of marionette staging. And that's where I'm at now. And it took 3 years to get there because it's actually quite hard to tell a story with a few ping pong balls. But I'm enjoying it very much, and the workshop, I realise, was there for years just to teach me the things I need to know so that I can do the parachute now. And it's like a performed version of the workshop that we all did today. I'm sure you saw the way it joins in with it.
Wonderful. Okay, there's aspects of magic that I'm hoping is going to come through a little bit in the Q&A, but I think it's probably a good time to open it up for questions. I should also say this event's being filmed, just so you're aware, so anything you say may end up on the internet somewhere. Well, in a controlled manner, of course. Anyway, any questions? We've got one here.
At the beginning of the workshop today, you spoke really briefly about sort of this exchange of energy with the puppet and to getting something from the puppet, and that actually being a negative thing.
Carry on.
Yeah. And I was wondering about whether you have an emotional connection to any puppets in particular over the time that you've been working, and how that's affected the work here.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I do think that's quite an important thing, and what I was saying this morning is that a lot of people are attracted towards puppet theatre because what is magical for us as performers is that you lose yourself into the puppet, and the puppet starts to do stuff almost like it's external to you, and so you really feel some sort of magic happening, that it's like it unlocks a subconscious part of ourselves. And my point this morning was that I think in terms of performance, that on its own can be a negative thing because you're doing it more for yourself than you are for the audience in a way. And although you get something back from the puppet and you're surprised by what it can do and it's magical for you, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's magical for people watching in the audience. So my point was really that needs to be based on some sort of real technical knowledge as well, and some practice and all of those things. And we need to check the effect of what we're doing for an audience by working either in mirrors or on video or just having very good directorial eyes all the time telling us what they see. But ultimately, I think that we all deserve the gratification that the puppet can give us and that we can have it, but we ought to take it responsibly and make sure that we can perform before we do it for ourselves. So it was really that. And the second part of the question is that I have flirted with glove puppets quite a lot. And I have 1 or 2 glove puppets that I'm very fond of. And it's surprising, they're very dear to me, these characters, and they really are characters, whereas most of the things in my other shows aren't characters. And I suppose years ago I thought maybe when I get old, I'll start taking out the glove puppets and I'll go smaller that way, but now I've got ping pong balls, I won't need them.
Flirting with glove puppets, that's a nice... is there an element of you don't want to use them? There's sometimes an embarrassment factor with glove puppets, or they're not proper puppets, or
no, it's not that. It's just that I don't know. There's something to be said for a bit of gravitas, I think, with puppets. And when I play with the glove puppets, they always make me laugh, and I expect that if I would want them to make an audience laugh, and I quite like to have some depth, which is underneath humour. And
Fab. Any other questions?
You just mentioned a little bit about character there, and so with the parachute, you obviously have the central character, but how much is that? How much do you haven't formed this question properly in my mind, but one thing did today in the workshop was trying to mimic like the simplest bits of data in order to mimic a human movement, and I struggled to not try and input onto it a certain type of character. And what's your, with the parachute specifically, it's quite a neutral, it's a mimic of movement, and it's quite neutral. Have you ever played with it trying to be a different type of character, like have a little, I don't know, swag? That's all it's doing with my body, but
Yeah. Well, I suppose the thing is that the show is quite young, and I am surprised each time I do it. There are a few little things that change and little experiments that are done in the heat of the moment, and the things that please me are exactly those little details that give it a personality. And what surprises me is that there are little things which I've heard the same little response from the audience when I've done the same movement. And we're dealing here with ping pong balls that are moving a centimetre in a particular way at a particular time, and everybody in the audience, or at least half the audience, make a sound because of that, because they've picked up a little bit of bit of humanity in the thing. I find that incredible and really personally very gratifying that you can do something so small and communicate something that you feel about people to a whole load of people, and they pick it up as well. So those things may come, and they're very valuable, and I hope that they do. But there are a few. Yeah, there are a few already in there, and I think that you do see some personality stuff, especially when he's playing with the baby, this man who's me, and I think that hopefully as the thing progresses, he will become more and more of a character as I get to know when those moments are with the audience, and I know what carries and what doesn't.
Is the idea that in the parachute you disappear completely?
No, not really, because I tried that. It's very difficult to do, but I can wear a hood and I can make myself pretty much invisible. But the thing is that what happens is you end up seeing it as a film when that happens. It's surprising, but the brain just tells you you're watching an animated film, and you forget that somebody's manipulating the ping pong balls. So in the end, I decided I would be visible, and I'd make my head come in occasionally. And
there's a conscious, like you're aware of when your head's in view and when it's not, or it's just...
No, I'm not always aware. I know that there's a moment when I have to lean down over to the left of the stage to pick something up, and I can't avoid my head being visible at that moment, and I would like to hide it. But these are tiny things to try and iron out with time, I think.
There was also an interesting moment in Watch the Ball afterwards where you put on sunglasses.
Yeah.
And I wonder what the motivation behind that is.
Well, that's a really important thing, because if you don't put on sunglasses, then the audience can see where I'm looking, so they know what I'm going to do next, because I've already told them by my eye line. So if you can see my eyes, then I can't do magic. But if you can't see my eyes, then you'll believe in the puppet doing stuff. So that's an important technical thing.
So is this, I'm just going to abuse my position here as asking questions, but we talked about magic in the workshop. Are you in your eyes doing magic?
Well, I mean, everybody that does something in front of an audience and wants them to have a magical reaction, I suppose, is doing magic at some level. But I'm doing something with puppets or ping pong balls or marionettes or something, and what I want is the audience has a good time, and they get stimulated by what they see, and that they feel that it's been worthwhile. And I mean, we're all trying to produce magical moments for an audience, I think. And it's my motive anyways, to try and do that. But whether that is magic in the prestidigitation sense, I'm not sure.
There's an interesting relationship there that I think is... something, is interesting. Anyway, we have a question here and a question here. Let's start with here.
My question's about music and the importance, because a good part of Parachute was the music.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the working method you adopt?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked me that, because the music is so often overlooked by people. It's so easy to just see a show and think that you've just seen something, and obviously the music has a tremendously important input. And all of the things that I've done have been collaborations with composers in one way or another. So over the years I've worked with quite a lot of people, but Sebastian wrote the music for Organillo, which is the show tomorrow night at Northern Stage, and we've stayed very good friends, and so he works around the world. He was in Columbia University in Mexico City for 3 years, so I hadn't seen him for a while, and then he turned up back in the UK and he came to see me. He said, "Well, what are you doing, Stephen?" And I said, "Well, I've got these ping pong balls." And he basically, to my delight, he said, "Well, you want some music for it, just tell me." So that's a sort of responsibility, because he has to be paid quite a lot of money and he's a very good composer. But anyway, he was as good as his word, and I said, "Well, would you want to write some music for ping pong balls?" And he said, "Yeah, that sounds doable." So, but we've been doing it for 2.5, the whole project took 3 years, so 2.5 years from that conversation to actually making it. And in that time he was working in Buenos Aires quite a lot, so we ended up making it like an animated film, and I made a sequence that I was pleased with and I was prepared to stick with, because I couldn't ask him to do it again, and then I would put it on WeTransfer and send it off as a piece of film to him. And this time he wrote it as music for animated film, but we'd agreed that we wanted to make it a suite of dances as well, so that it actually exists as a piece of music, which is a series of little dances, and there's a tango and a waltz and all these little bits and pieces. So it sort of exists as a piece of work called The Parachute, but then it's also timed perfectly to the events that happen in the show as well. And bit by bit it came together, and yeah, we managed to do it.
We're going to go...
Sorry, I didn't... Can I just clarify something?
Yeah.
Did you do the sequences first and then he composed the music to it?
Yeah.
Or he composed the music?
No, always
and
the movement first. And when we did Organillo, we did the same. We always did the movement sequences first, and then he made the music. But there is an interim moment where he's in the workshop with me while we're making the sequences as well. And so he's thinking about what goes well. And we have a CD player, and he's got his various devices for playing music, and we just play loads and loads of sounds with things, and we try to find unusual combinations of what you can do with an action and a piece of sound. Because sometimes the theatricality comes from just just finding a really good pair of things that go together.
Sorry, thanks.
No problem. Did you have a question?
Yeah, just about working on your own. I don't know how you work in your rehearsal space, but is it a lot of things on your own, figuring out problems and then
Yeah.
film it?
Yeah, a lot of despair.
What do you do? Get stuck.
I do get stuck. I find it terribly hard, and I hate rehearsing, really with a vengeance. If I know that I've got to prepare for shows, I just, I wake up in the worst mood, because I can't bear the amount of self-discipline it takes to rehearse on your own. And coming here, for example, I had to spend nearly 8 days rehearsing, because I had to rehearse the Parachute back up again, and then I had to take everything out of my workshop and rehearse the Organillo show, which is a big, heavy thing that only just fits in the workshop. And the discipline that you need to do that, and to go through it, and then to go through it again, and to just make sure that everything's working is very hard. And I find those very lonely moments where it would be really good to have a director who said, "Come on, Stephen, just do it again." You know that you want to. I don't, I hate it.
Find moments without a director where you're like, I just want someone to tell me what looks good.
Yeah.
Just do my sort.
Yeah, I'd like that.
Have you never had a director?
No, I've always had directors for the stuff. I didn't for the Parachute, I did it myself, because it was so tiny, and I thought it depends so much on this very limited range of things that you can do with the ping pong balls anyway. There's almost no point in somebody telling me, "Oh, well, you could do it better if you did it like this," because, sorry, can't do it like that. You can only do it like this. This is the only way you can get those 5 to move in this way. So with the Parachute I didn't. And for another reason, which I'll come to. But with all the other shows, I've always had a director, and I think to work without a director is folly, really. If you can avoid it, you should always have a director, because you just can't have any idea what works and what doesn't work by yourself. It's sometimes the difference between a successful little moment and an unsuccessful one is so tiny, and only somebody that's separate from you can tell you, I think. So.
We're going to go here.
With the Panzer, how long did you do that for, and
Where did you?
Well, I didn't do it. He's never been
You didn't
performed.
do it?
No, I made it, and he's a little man who walks around and does stuff. And it's interesting because I made it before I'd ever seen anybody else's puppets or seen another string puppet in reality. I only knew them as an idea really before that. And it's funny, I've never seen one like it, and I've never seen one that has the same relationship of strings to the body. But he does do quite interesting things. And,
So how did you move on from built Pantagruel and then?
then I made a lot of other stuff.
Oh, right. Oh yes.
And then I'm trying to think the first time I ever performed on my own. I made do you know that there's a book by I think Gordon Fraser called The Puppet Circus? I think it's by him. Do you know that one?
I think I've seen
It's got
it
really
before,
lovely
yes.
inspirational drawings
Is
of
it all illustrated?
yeah, string puppets, and I read this book and I thought they were really interesting things, and so I made 5 coloured wooden puppets based on the drawings in that book, and then I was working in France at this time, and I mean, without giving you my whole biography, I got a bursary to study in England, and I went off to the Puppet Theatre School in Budapest, and when I came back, I did the Alice in Wonderland film that Anglia Television made, and then after that I went off to live in France, and while I was there I started performing these just on the street, these circus marionettes, and that led to me making a show which I toured in schools, and from about 1985 onwards that's what I was doing. Every day I was doing 2 shows in 2 different primary schools somewhere in the country, and in 1 year I did 247 performances with string puppets, and wore out a van in 3 years as well, but in the late 80s. And so Pantagruel never saw an audience yet, but a few later puppets did, 3 or 4 years later.
You started on the street.
Yeah.
Marilee?
Yes, I just wanted to ask, in the very moment where you're starting, you already have an idea and you know the materials that you're going to use, like the basic techniques that are going to come into the show to give them life. But when you go into your studio, you say, okay, I'm going to start working on shaping this. How is the balance between like creating the concept, between what's happening in your mind and what you're actually creating, how improvisation comes into it? If you were to establish, say, a line of how the whole thing is shaped,
Yeah.
how is it that, more or less, if you could say there's a pattern to your work?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. What I would say that the pattern for everything that I've done has been movement rather than puppet, and we tend to think of puppet theatre as being something which starts with the puppet and then radiates out from the puppet. And for me, that hasn't been the case. It has been something that I find interesting to do with the way that something moves, and usually the ideas are movement-based ideas. For example, the show that I've done the most and which I'm most proud of is The Seed Carriers, which I made in 1995, or at least was performed first in 1995. And that started out with me having the idea of making hybrid marionettes which had got a human shape in them, but they were animals, but where inside the animal there was a human being manipulating the animal from inside. So that at the top you've got all the stuff of a marionette control, but for example, a figure which you can find quite a lot of pictures of on the internet is of a man in this position holding a bird's tail in his hands, standing on stilts which have got birds' feet on them, walking backwards, if that means anything. So you've got this is the tail of a bird, and the head is worn on the back of the man's head. So you have a sort of standard old marionette of a walking bird, but it actually has a human figure who appears to be operating the bird, walking backwards. And that was a concept which I really went with. So I made a whole load of marionettes of the same size and in the same style, which were hybrid figures, which were an animal and a human figure. And again, the thing is about getting high on an idea. I got high on that idea, and it led to other ideas and other things that were linked to it. And that for a year, I was just making stuff all the time, and I couldn't think of anything else. I just wanted to go back in the workshop and keep on making this stuff, which was about I don't know, how people hide inside structures, and how we must bring things round us to make us feel secure. But then there's a moment where you're so surrounded by security that you can't get out of it anymore, and you feel that you need to burst out and tear it all down. And if you saw the parachute, you'll see that that's still my main concern in life. You know, you one moment you feel insecure, so you put cage bars around yourself, and the next moment you feel so trapped that you just got to get out again.
So basically, just so I understand, so you get from the object of, like you said, you become like obsessed with this idea of what the object can give you in terms of movement, and then you start developing.
Yeah, I think that what happens to me is I make a load of stuff, and the workshop fills up with things that I just get the idea of making, and which I get some sort of enjoyment from making, and which inspire me in some way. And there's a moment where you look at everything you've got, and you suddenly realise what you're doing and why you've made it, and how it all fits together. And this is obviously one of the reasons that I've always worked alone, because it's working like a sculptor in a way. You're going on a little sculptural journey, only it's sculpture with movement involved as well. And at the end of it, you have something to present. And maybe the whole thing is very personal and can be very ambiguous for an audience, but it is also rich, because it means something. At least to you it means something, and an audience picks up on it, has integrity, and it fits together somehow. It touches important themes, I think.
Did we have another question hiding?
I think maybe that you answered that question there. I just was interested in those, how the relation of those moments that you develop by beautiful movements, which which move the audience because they read immediately as being alive. And then how you work with those to create the bigger thing of a show. And I just think maybe within what you've said there, you probably answered that it kind of comes from that process of generating things and playing with them, and then gradually.
Yeah. Well, I was saying, are you talking about the ping pong balls, or not?
I suppose in my mind I was thinking about how you create a larger thing from smaller little play narratives that work well with facing bubbles or anything that looks alive and beautiful, and how it grows into something which is more of a journey. Yeah, well,
you find one thing and then you find something else, and then you need a bridge that takes the two, connects the two, and usually you find that bridge. The process is the important thing I found with time is that you go into the workshop and you do something, and it doesn't really matter. Don't switch on the computer. Just make something and look at it in a mirror, and maybe that's all you need to do in one particular day. But almost always, if I start making anything at my workbench, after a couple of hours I'm really into what I'm doing, and I find that becomes part of of the large creative process, and that almost everything finds a way to tie in with what you feel at any one time.
Okay, so we're going to make this the last question in the middle here.
I'd like to ask where you feel most of your learnings come from. You mentioned Budapest, observation of people in general, but you've learned about movement and using puppets. Could you briefly kind of describe how or where you've done your learning?
Yeah, well, I haven't got very much formal training as a performer. I can play a few tunes on the guitar, and then I did a lot of performances of shows in primary schools. And you do learn a lot of stuff by doing the same thing many, many times. For example, I did loads and loads of shows in primary schools where I got the children to sit on the floor, and I had a stage which was 30 centimetres high, and then I did marionettes on that stage, so that the marionettes were this high off the ground, and the children, sometimes 150 children, were all sitting on the floor. And I'd done this maybe 100 times before somebody came and they said to me, "Do you know only the front row can see the puppets?" So I'm really sorry for those 100 audiences, maybe 10,000 children.
You just had to sit there.
Yeah, they just sat there and they couldn't see anything because nobody told me, and I didn't think of it for myself. So that you do learn. After that, I never did it again. I always made sure that everybody could see, and I checked before I started. But it's a real shame that sometimes learning is at somebody's expense. but you do learn, and now I know that sight lines are a really important part of everything that you do, and you need to think about that really carefully. And I suppose all the other little aspects of performing are things that you have to learn painfully by making loads of mistakes first, and somebody will eventually tell you you've been doing it wrong for a long time. And there's a tremendous arrogance about teaching workshops, for example. You know, we're not. A lot of people that teach workshops in the arts are not actually trained to teach, but they have some experience, which it's fine for people to share with other people. I think that's a very good way for other people to learn as well. But I started in, I think, 1991 doing workshops, and the things that came out of my mouth in 1991 I am deeply ashamed of. But I can't go back and stop them. So there's loads of people that probably think that I believe all sorts of things that I used to, but I don't anymore. And
I mean, so like other performances you watched where you just felt you were learning from the performance.
Well, exactly, all of that, but a lot from watching other people. I mean, doing workshops is really a two-way thing, and you learn a tremendous amount by watching other people doing stuff. And all of the parachute and all of the Watch the Ball show that I did at Cobalt yesterday, all of that came from watching other people doing things in workshops. And you know, I've stolen all their ideas, but or at least they made them with me, and I've claimed them in some way.
A great thing about
But just to finish off, in terms of formal learning, it's really just by watching things and deciding what you like and what you don't like, and what you think and what you don't approve of and what you do approve of. And stuff, and everybody's different, and puppet theatre is a massive, massive range of possibilities, and you can do it so many different ways that if anybody ever tries and tells you that there's only one way to do it, you can immediately show them the antidote to that attitude and show them there's another way of doing it. But yeah, what else? No more training.
Brills, Stephen's going to be around probably for a little bit, so do grab him if you haven't had a chance to ask a question. This is a pay-as-you-feel event, I should say, so if you do think it was worth a few of your coins, then please do drop them in Marilee's bucket. Also, there are feedback forms on your chairs, so if you've been to this or any of the other Meet the Practitioner events, we really appreciate you filling that out, because it's important for funding things. We want this to happen again next year, and evaluation is a key part of that. And all that's left to say is thanks very much to Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you.
So much better.